The flight began like any other as the passengers walked down the jet bridge, chatting among themselves, dragging carry-on bags, and searching for their seats. She moved among them in her uniform, smiling softly, her gestures practiced and flawless. She looked like any other flight attendant, her hair neatly tied, her voice calm and professional, yet beneath that mask lay a truth. No one could guess a truth that would shatter the illusion of routine and bring fear into the hearts of even the most seasoned warriors of the sky. She checked overhead bins, she offered assistance to families and business travelers, her every move smooth and natural, her face a mask of quiet patience. But her mind was elsewhere. It was not on drink service or seatbelt checks. It was locked on instincts drilled into her long ago, instincts that never left even after years of silence. She remembered nights when she wore a different uniform, when her role was not to comfort but to command, when her voice over radios carried codes that shifted the balance of missions. Her past was buried deep, wrapped in shadows and silence, hidden behind civilian life, but no past this dangerous ever truly dies. As she walked the narrow aisle, she felt eyes brush over her, unaware of who she truly was, unaware that within arm's reach stood someone with clearance to access secrets higher than most generals could dream. She offered smiles to strangers who would never know they were being served by someone who once knew the feel of combat skies, the sound of encrypted voices, and the sudden silence that follows when an order is obeyed. To her this flight was routine, yet not routine. For every moment she was listening and watching and waiting for something undefined, waiting for the faint tremor in the air that always came before events that could not be stopped. She knew patterns of danger, she had studied them, lived them, and survived them. Her hands carried trays, but her mind counted seconds. Her feet shifted in the aisle, yet her eyes swept exits and threats invisible to others. Passengers leaned back in comfort, believing this was an ordinary trip, but to her the ordinary no longer existed. The captain greeted passengers over the intercom, his voice steady, his tone polite, and she smiled along with the others. Yet she noticed the subtle inflections, the slight hesitation that most would dismiss, but not her, never her. She knew what unease sounded like. She knew when voices carried secrets, and his voice already hinted at one she could not yet see, but she felt it creeping closer, like a shadow stretching silently over the flight. Would the shadow reveal itself before the passengers sensed it, or would it remain hidden just long enough for everything to change? She moved through the aisle with steady steps, her tray balanced easily in her hands, her smile unchanged, her voice soft and reassuring to those who asked for water or coffee or blankets. Yet behind her calm mask her eyes missed nothing. She studied the passengers, the way they held their bodies, the way their voices rose and fell, the smallest tremor in a hand or glance in a direction others would not care to see. She had trained herself long ago to read people, to know their intentions before they themselves realized them, and that training never left, not in years, not in silence, not in the disguise she now wore as an attendant blending among strangers. Every seat she passed gave her another detail: the man by the window too eager with his laughter, perhaps nervous, the woman clutching her bag too tightly holding something valuable, or maybe just memories she could not let go, the two teenagers across the aisle whispering too quietly, their eyes darting like sparrows. Every face was a code, and she knew how to read codes faster than most people read words. Her uniform may have fooled them, but she knew she was still what she always had been, an operative. At heart, a protector in the shadows. The engines roared a steady hum, and the cabin smelled of fresh coffee and recycled air, but to her the noise was a blanket covering subtler sounds: the faint click of a seatbelt buckle forced open, the irregular shuffle of feet toward the lavatory, and she counted these like markers in her mind. Her senses were sharper than anyone realized, even sharper now because she had felt unease ever since the aircraft door had closed behind them, and she trusted that feeling. It had saved her more than once. It had pulled her back from fire and steel when missions fell apart. It whispered now just as it whispered then, and she knew better than to ignore it. A mother pressed her call button asking for juice. She smiled, bent down gently, and handed it over, her voice warm as if she were no different from anyone else, but her eyes kept flicking toward the cockpit door, as if the metal frame could suddenly shatter with news she already felt crawling through her veins. She did not know the shape of what was coming, but she knew it was coming, and soon. Passengers chatted happily, flipping through magazines, unaware that their safety depended on the watchful eyes of someone they believed was just another attendant. Yet she kept watching because something unseen was drawing near, and it would not stay hidden for long. The cabin air felt the same to everyone else, but to her it carried a change so faint that no passenger could have sensed it. She felt it in the way the engines seemed to hum slightly deeper, in the way the captain's voice over the intercom carried a note that did not belong. He made his usual announcements calm and polite, yet when he signed off there was a pause too long, too heavy for routine, and she caught it instantly, her instincts sharpening like a blade against stone. She set her tray aside, her movements still graceful, her smile still in place, yet within her chest Her heartbeat steadied, not raced, because training had taught her long ago that stillness, not panic, is what keeps one alive when the unknown approaches. She caught a glance at the cockpit door as the first officer slipped inside, his face pale, his steps urgent, hidden from passengers but not from her. She noticed every detail. She had always noticed details, and she knew now that whatever news had reached the crew was serious enough to break the mask of professionalism he tried to carry. She felt tension crawling into the walls of the aircraft, and she knew it would spread whether the passengers realized it or not. The seatbelt signs remained off. The passengers reclined and laughed, some sipping drinks, others tapping at screens, none aware that the balance of the flight was shifting, none aware that their lives were entering the orbit of forces far greater than they could imagine. She looked out the small window at the endless stretch of sky, her reflection staring back at her, and in that reflection she saw not a flight attendant but the ghost of what she once had been, the shadow of missions carried out in silence, the echo of codes spoken into radios at midnight, and she knew those ghosts were stirring once again. A tremor ran through the deck, so small no one else noticed, but she did, and she knew it was not turbulence, it was something else, something mechanical, something controlled. She rose slowly, walked the aisle, as if checking passengers, yet her eyes were on the edges of the cabin where shadows fell and sounds lingered. She caught sight of the captain's hand, gripping the yoke tighter than usual. She caught the way his shoulders were rigid even from behind the door window, and she knew without a doubt that the change was real. The question was not if it would reach them, but how soon it would reveal itself and what it would demand from her once it did. The moment crept in with silence so heavy it pressed against her chest, though no one else felt it. The passengers still chatted, laughed, and ordered drinks, yet her eyes were drawn to the edges of the windows where the endless sky seemed to stretch wider than usual. She knew that look, she had seen it before on flights that were never meant for comfort or leisure, flights where shadows appeared out of nowhere and changed everything. The captain's voice crackled again over the intercom, firm but restrained, telling passengers to remain seated due to expected turbulence, but she heard the weight in his tone, and she knew turbulence had nothing to do with it. Inside the cockpit, radar whispered warnings, encoded blips and sweeps. Too fast, moving contacts were closing in, high above and behind, closing distance with precision, not like wandering aircraft, not like harmless civilian planes, but like predators on the hunt. The first officer muttered numbers. The captain nodded, but his jaw was set like stone, and though the crew tried to hide it, their fear seeped through like smoke through cracks. She could almost feel it drift through the cabin, though the passengers sensed nothing. Then she heard it, faint at first, a low rumble that did not belong to their engines, a sound she knew too well, the sound of power cutting through air at speeds only predators could manage. Her gaze locked onto the window, and for a heartbeat she saw nothing but blue. Then the silver shape emerged, slicing through the sky like a blade glinting in sunlight, an F-22 Raptor, its wings sharp, its presence undeniable. It moved with ease, with authority, and then another followed until the jetliner was flanked on both sides. Passengers leaned toward the glass, excitement sparking laughter, some raised phones eager to capture what they thought was a spectacle, a rare sight to brag about back home. But she knew better. Her stomach tightened, not with fear, but with the cold recognition of what these machines meant. They were not here to entertain, they were here to test, to demand, to judge whether this flight was what it claimed to be. She watched one of the Raptors tilt slightly, its pilot's gaze locked toward the cockpit of the airliner, silent yet filled with questions that would soon demand answers. She sat perfectly still, her tray untouched, her posture calm, but her eyes burned with focus, because she knew this was the beginning, not the end, and what came next would decide whether the shadows outside would remain watchers or become executioners. The air inside the cabin thickened, though the passengers laughed nervously and pressed their faces to the windows, watching the Raptors glide alongside their jet, sleek and deadly like wolves circling prey. Some passengers joked about free escorts, others whispered uneasily, unsure whether to smile or to worry. The captain spoke again over the intercom, his words steady, but his tone edged with strain, assuring everyone it was only a standard procedure, only a routine check. Yet she knew the truth, routine never looked like this, not with Raptors moving in formation so tight and precise, not with silence on the radio stretching this long. She watched the captain through the small glass in the cockpit door, his shoulders stiff, his hand gripping controls harder than before, his eyes darting between instruments and the sky, his body betraying what his voice tried to hide. She had seen that body language in other men, in other skies long ago, men who knew that one wrong response, one delayed code, could turn silence into fire in less than a breath. The first officer bent forward, tense, sweat glistening under the dim cockpit lights as he tried to respond to the queries crackling through their channel. She felt the pressure building like a storm contained within a fragile cabin, the passengers oblivious, their chatter blending with the steady hum of the engines, her instincts screaming louder with each passing second. She could almost hear the voices over the encrypted lines, the demands, the suspicion, the challenge that the military pilots were throwing at the captain, and she knew he did not have the clearance to give them what they wanted. The Raptors shifted closer, wings tilting, shadows sliding across the cabin windows, their presence no longer passive but pressing, their demand silent but clear, and though the passengers still smiled for picture, some of them began to sense it too, the weight of something wrong hanging invisible above their heads. She rose from her jump seat, moving slowly, her smile still in place, her steps graceful, as though she were simply walking the aisle, yet inside her mind every second stretched sharp and precise. She knew the code they sought, she knew the language hidden beneath silence, and she knew the crew could not answer it, not without her, not without the past she had buried. She felt the moment pressing against her like the final second before a trigger pull, the moment where choice decides everything. Would she step forward now, or would she let silence drag them all into the unknown? She moved with a calm that belied the storm rising outside. Every passenger still believed she was only a flight attendant serving drinks and checking belts, but her steps carried the weight of years, the weight of a history no one here would ever be told. She reached the cockpit door, and the first officer startled when he saw her approach, as if he sensed she did not belong, yet something in her eyes made him step aside without question. She entered the small space where the captain gripped the radio. His face pale, his voice faltering under the pressure of demands he could not answer. She placed a steady hand on his arm, her touch firm but not forceful, her gaze unyielding. She whispered only once, "Let me handle this," and the captain, though reluctant, shifted back, because there was something in her tone, something that spoke not of request but of authority, that outranked the very wings on his chest. She picked up the radio, the static buzzing cold and sharp in the cramped cockpit. Her voice emerged low, precise, controlled. She spoke a single call sign, a sequence of sounds that seemed ordinary yet carried a weight buried deep in classified vaults, a sound that had not been spoken on open air in years. The channel went silent, the demand from the Raptors cut off mid-word, as if the pilots themselves had frozen in disbelief. Her voice lingered in the silence, steady, unwavering. Every man in that cockpit felt the shift in the air. The first officer blinked, his lips parted, as if to ask, but no words came. The captain's grip on the yoke loosened slightly, not in relief, but in recognition that something far larger than him had just entered his flight. Outside, the Raptors wavered, their formation broken by hesitation. One tilted its wing, pulling slightly back, the other steadied yet did not move closer. The pilots' voices returned at last, faint over the channel, different now, filled not with authority, but with something else, something between respect and fear. They repeated her call sign quietly, as though confirming it, as though reminding themselves that it was real. In the cabin, passengers leaned forward against the glass, still laughing, still unaware that history was being rewritten in silence 30,000 feet above ground. She held the radio calmly, her face unreadable, but inside she felt the past stir like fire in her veins, the part of her she had buried long ago, answering without hesitation to the code she had once lived by. The silence held heavy, the question unspoken in every breath: who was she truly, and what power did that single call sign command? The silence that followed her call sign was heavier than any turbulence the aircraft had ever endured. Even the captain, who had faced storms and engine failures, sat frozen, his eyes locked on her, as though seeing someone not of this world. The first officer whispered the words again under his breath, repeating the call sign like a forbidden phrase, trying to understand what it meant, but deep down he knew it belonged to something above his clearance, above anything a civilian airline should ever touch. Outside, the Raptors shifted their positions again, their sleek forms now hovering at a careful distance, no longer pressing in close, their movements slower, more deliberate, almost cautious. She watched through the narrow window as one pilot tilted his helmeted head slightly toward the cockpit of the airliner, a gesture not of aggression but of acknowledgement, the kind reserved for those who carried power beyond rank, beyond protocol. She recognized it at once, for she had seen that gesture before in darker skies, when missions balanced on the edge of catastrophe. The crew inside the cockpit remained silent, waiting for her to explain, but she offered them nothing, her lips pressed together, her eyes unblinking, because explanations were dangerous. Explanations opened doors that were meant to remain sealed. She knew the weight of classified oaths she had sworn. She knew that one slip could unravel years of silence, and she was not about to risk it now, not with so many lives tied to her presence. Her silence became its own answer, and that answer terrified them more than words could have. The Raptors held their distance, but their message was clear. They had recognized the call sign, and they would not challenge it, not today, not ever. The power behind it reached too far into the hidden networks of history to ignore. The pilots may not even have known the full truth, but they knew enough to back away, enough to respect the authority that her voice carried. Even disguised as a flight attendant, she had revealed a fragment of who she truly was. The passengers still laughed, still snapped photos, still unaware of the invisible war that had almost engulfed them. The hum of the engines steadied, the cabin lights glowed soft and ordinary, yet within that cockpit nothing was ordinary anymore. The captain finally exhaled, his hands trembling slightly on the controls. The first officer leaned back, staring at her, as if waiting for a confession, but she gave none. The only question that remained unspoken and unanswered: who exactly was she, and how deep did her past truly run? The cockpit remained tight with silence broken only by the steady crackle of the radio, and the low hum of the engines. The captain turned toward her, his eyes hard with questions that he dared not speak too loudly. The first officer leaned forward, his voice trembling, as he asked, "What just happened? What did you say? Who are you?" His words came fast, desperate, carrying the weight of fear disguised as curiosity. She did not look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the window where the raptors lingered in cautious formation, their wings glinting in the sunlight like blades held at bay. Her silence pressed heavier than any answer could have, and that silence drove the crew deeper into unease. The captain raised his voice low but firm. "You used a code. You spoke something that made them back off. Tell me what it means," he demanded. Yet, even as he asked, he knew she would not answer, for there was a command in her posture, in her calm stillness, that reminded him of generals he had once flown under. She carried authority not written on paper, but carved into presence itself, and that alone told him enough. She turned finally, her eyes steady, her voice soft yet sharp. When she said, "It is better you do not know," those words chilled the air more than any threat could have, because the captain understood she was protecting him by refusing, and that truth frightened him even more. The first officer swallowed hard, his fingers twitching near the controls, as though he feared the next sound on the radio might bring everything crashing down. He asked again, his tone breaking, "What kind of call sign was that? Who are you really?" And she gave him nothing, only a faint curve of her lips, a smile that carried no warmth, only finality. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, both realizing they were flying with someone whose past belonged to shadows far beyond their world. They could not decide whether to be grateful or terrified. They only knew the raptors had recognized her, and that recognition had saved them from a fate they could not imagine. Still, the unanswered question clawed at their minds. Back in the cabin, the passengers remained oblivious, sipping drinks, joking about fighter escorts, taking pictures with shaking hands that disguised excitement for fear. Only the crew and the silent attendant knew the truth, that they had just crossed into a hidden war that few ever saw. And the silence she left in her wake promised that whatever she once was, she could still become again if the skies demanded it. The raptors no longer pressed close. Instead, they held a steady distance, like guardians watching from the edge of vision, their presence still heavy in the sky, yet no longer suffocating. The captain tried to focus on his instruments, his hands steadying, though his mind still reeled from the moment that had just passed. The first officer kept glancing toward her, unable to shake the image of her calm face, and the sound of the call sign that had frozen men, trained never to hesitate. The silence between them was louder than any storm. She returned to the cabin, walking with the same quiet grace as before. Passengers smiled at her, some joked about how exciting it was to see real fighter jets up close. One man even asked if she knew why they were there. She only gave a soft laugh, shaking her head as if she were as clueless as they were, blending perfectly once again into the role of ordinary attendant. Yet her eyes still swept the windows every few minutes, her senses sharper, instincts alive, because though the raptors had pulled back, she knew their eyes were still locked on them, and she knew this flight was not yet safe. The children in the back row pressed their faces against the glass, giggling as they waved at the sleek machines outside. The pilots may have seen them, may have nodded slightly, but no one else could sense the tension hanging in the invisible space between those aircraft and the commercial jet. She could feel it, though, like static crawling across her skin. She knew the raptors were waiting, watching, listening for another word, another signal, and the knowledge of that power weighed heavily in her chest. Hours stretched on, though each minute felt elongated, as though time itself feared to move forward. The hum of the engines remained steady, the seatbelt lights flickered now and then, but the cabin looked ordinary again. Passengers drifted to sleep, headphones on, blankets pulled close, unaware of how thin the line of safety had truly been. She stood at the galley pouring coffee, smiling with ease, yet her mind replayed the silence after she spoke the call sign and the way the raptors had faltered. The captain made another announcement, cheerful, practiced, his voice steadier now, promising arrival on schedule. But even as he spoke, he glanced once toward her from the cockpit, his eyes holding the same question he had never voiced. He knew she carried something vast, something untouchable, and he also knew the sky itself had bowed to it. Yet the question remained, how long could she continue to hide behind the mask of an ordinary flight attendant before someone demanded to know the truth? The wheels touched down smooth against the runway. The passengers clapped in relief, as if unaware how close they had come to danger. They laughed, they gathered their bags, they stretched their legs, thinking only of destinations and families waiting on the ground. The captain made his final announcement, his voice warm, practiced, almost cheerful, yet underneath it lay the weight of unanswered questions he could never place into words, not without breaking the fragile line between truth and silence. She stood at the exit, her uniform neat, her smile unshaken, guiding passengers out with soft words, thanking them for flying, each one passing her by without a second thought to them. She was no more than a kind face, no more than another flight attendant lost in the blur of travel. None of them could have guessed what power had just stood within reach. None could have imagined what single call sign could do to freeze steel-hearted pilots mid-word. The crew lingered longer, eyes drifting toward her as though expecting an explanation. She gave none. Her silence was a shield, her smile a curtain. She gathered her small bag and stepped off the plane, blending with the stream of strangers moving into the terminal, her steps light, her face calm, no different from anyone else, yet every motion was deliberate, a vanishing act perfected over years of shadows. The captain tried to follow, but by the time he reached the terminal she was gone, swallowed by the crowd like smoke fading into air. He scanned the faces rushing past, hoping to catch even a glimpse, yet there was nothing. She had vanished, leaving only the echo of her voice on the radio, and the look in the eyes of the raptors who had pulled away without another word. Rumors would spread among the crew, whispers traded in quiet corners of break rooms and bars. They would speak of the attendant who was not an attendant, of the call sign that turned war machines into statues of silence, but none of them would ever find answers. The truth would remain locked beneath layers of secrecy, guarded by oaths older than their careers. Outside the terminal the world moved on. Cars honked, luggage wheels rattled, families reunited in tears and laughter, and somewhere among them she walked unseen, disappearing into ordinary life, once more a ghost wrapped in a uniform, a secret hidden in plain sight. And though the flight ended safely, the question lingered heavy in the minds of those who had glimpsed her shadow. Who was she truly, and why did the skies themselves obey her?